It was a gray Sunday morning in a forgotten corner of the city, where rain puddles reflected neon signs and the rumble of motorcycles replaced church bells. Inside a weathered roadside diner called Lucky's, the scent of maple syrup and burnt toast mixed with the metallic tang of coffee that had sat too long on the burner. The yellow booths were cracked with age, their vinyl patched with duct tape, and the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead like tired bees. Truckers and early risers hunched over their plates, speaking in low voices, until a moment arrived that would shatter the Sunday quiet and remind them all what it meant to be human. A broad-shouldered biker named Marcus Kane, known on the highway as Viper, sat at the counter nursing his third cup of coffee. He was a man built like a fortress, his leather jacket decorated with patches from a dozen different cities, his beard thick and streaked with gray. Silver rings adorned his fingers, and a faded scar ran along his jawline, a souvenir from a fight he'd rather forget. To anyone who glanced his way, he looked dangerous, the kind of man you'd cross the street to avoid. But his eyes, dark and weary, told a different story, one of sleepless nights and a burden he carried alone. He stared at his plate of pancakes and eggs, pushing the food around absently, lost in thoughts he couldn't escape. If you believe that redemption can come from the most broken places, if you believe that strangers can save each other without ever knowing why, then pause this video for a second. Like, comment, share, and subscribe to Bike Diaries. Your support keeps these stories of real humanity alive. That's when the door creaked open, letting in a gust of cold air and a boy who looked far too young to be out alone. He couldn't have been more than 12, skinny as a rail, with dark circles under his eyes that made him look older than his years. His jacket was too thin for the weather, and his sneakers had holes that let the rain seep through. He carried a tattered backpack over one shoulder, and his hands trembled. Whether from cold or fear, no one could tell. The bell above the door jingled weakly, but the sound seemed to echo louder than usual, bouncing off the chrome and faded vinyl seats. The few customers scattered around the diner lifted their heads. The clink of silverware slowed. A man in a work jacket paused mid-bite, watching the boy with the detached curiosity people reserve for the kind of pain they'd rather not acknowledge. The boy's eyes swept across the diner with the practiced caution of someone who had learned to expect rejection. He scanned faces quickly, like he'd done this before, entered places hoping for help, only to be met with silence or the cold, polite stare that said you don't belong here. The waitress, a tired woman named Gloria, looked up from wiping down tables. Her mascara was smudged from a long shift, and her smile was the kind you had to force by habit. For a moment, she froze. Then, slowly, she went back to cleaning, pretending not to see the boy. It wasn't cruelty. It was fatigue, the kind that comes from seeing too much need and not enough help to give. A trucker near the back glanced over, then shook his head and muttered something under his breath. The elderly couple by the window avoided eye contact entirely, the woman focusing intently on her tea, stirring it long after the sugar had dissolved. Only Marcus noticed how the boy's gaze fixed on the plates of food, the golden eggs, the steaming hash browns, the stack of pancakes dripping syrup. The kid's throat worked as he swallowed hard. His stomach must have been screaming, but he didn't move towards the food. Not yet. He walked slowly down the aisle between the booths, his steps hesitant, like each one might be his last. His sneakers made a soft squeak on the linoleum floor, the sound of wet rubber echoing faintly in the hush. The rain outside tapped against the glass, steady and cold. Then the boy stopped beside Marcus at the counter. His small frame was dwarfed by the biker's presence. Black leather jacket, broad shoulders, the smell of rain and engine oil clinging to him. For a long moment, the boy just stood there, gathering courage, his fingers twisting the strap of his backpack. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he spoke. "Excuse me, sir." His voice cracked. "Can I take the leftovers for my mom?" The diner fell silent. The clatter of forks against plates stopped. The hiss of the griddle seemed to fade. Even the rain against the windows grew quiet. Marcus turned slowly to look at the boy, and for a heartbeat, their eyes met. The kid's chin trembled, but he held his ground, his thin shoulders squared with desperate dignity. Marcus looked down at his plate, still half full, steam rising from the eggs he hadn't touched. Then he looked back at the boy, really looked at him, the dirt under his fingernails, the way his clothes hung loose on his frame, the raw hope mixed with shame in his young face. Something inside Marcus stirred, something buried deep under years of silence and asphalt miles. Marcus had been many things in his life. A soldier who came home to nothing, a father who lost his son to an illness he couldn't fight with his fists, a husband whose marriage crumbled under the weight of grief. For 15 years, he'd ridden alone, chasing horizons that never filled the void. He told himself the wind was enough company, that silence was peace. But the truth was, silence had just become the only voice that didn't remind him of what he'd lost. He'd convinced himself he was beyond feeling, that he'd buried his heart alongside his son. But looking at this kid, this stranger asking for scraps to feed his mother, something cracked in the armor he'd spent years building. Without a word, Marcus stood up. The stool screeched slightly against the tile, making the boy flinch. Tyler's hand instinctively went to his backpack strap, like he was ready to bolt. Marcus didn't move toward him. Instead, he turned to Gloria at the register. "Give me 2 of everything on the menu," he said, his voice rough but clear. "Hot. To go." Gloria blinked. "2 of everything?" "You heard me," Marcus said, pulling out his wallet. "And throw in whatever desserts you got. Orange juice, milk, coffee, if she drinks it." The boy's eyes widened, disbelief written across his face. Around them, the diner began to stir again. Whispers rippled through the room like wind through tall grass. A trucker at the corner booth reached for his wallet. The elderly couple by the window exchanged glances and nodded. While Gloria and the cook scrambled to fill the order, Marcus turned back to the boy. He pulled out a chair at the counter and nodded toward it. "Sit down, kid." "I can't pay." "Did I ask you to?" Marcus said, his tone calm but firm. He gestured to the stool. "Sit. You're eating now. Your mom gets the takeout." The boy hesitated, then climbed up onto the stool, his movements small and careful. Pride and hunger were locked in a silent war inside him. Gloria, without a word, set down a plate of fresh pancakes and a glass of milk. The boy stared at it like it was a mirage. "Go on," Marcus said quietly. "Eat." The first bite seemed to break something inside the kid. His shoulders shook, but he kept eating, trying to be slow, to have manners, to pretend he wasn't starving. But hunger has its own truth, and eventually it won. Marcus watched, his jaw tight, seeing not this boy but another one. Years ago, sitting at a kitchen table, syrup on his chin, laughing at something silly. He could almost hear that laughter again, echoing faintly in the back of his mind, like a song from another life. And for the first time in 15 years, Marcus didn't turn away from the memory. He let it stay. "What's your name?" Marcus asked. The boy swallowed. "Tyler, sir." "Where's your dad, Tyler?" The boy's eyes dropped to his plate. "Gone. 3 years now. Mom got sick last month. Lost her job. We've been staying at the shelter, but—" His voice trailed off. Marcus nodded slowly. He understood the things people didn't say. The silence that filled the space between sentences, heavy with fear, pride, and fatigue. He reached into his jacket and pulled out a worn leather wallet. Inside was more cash than a man like him usually carried. Money he'd been saving for nothing in particular because he had no one left to spend it on. He pulled out several bills and set them on the counter beside Tyler's plate. "That's not for food," Marcus said quietly. "That's for whatever your mom needs. Medicine, rent, bus fare, whatever." Tyler stared at the money, then up at Marcus, his eyes wide. "I can't. Why would you—" Marcus looked at him, really looked at him, and for the first time in 15 years, he let himself speak the truth out loud. "Because I had a son once, and if he was still here, if he needed help and I wasn't around, I'd want someone to do this for him." The words hung in the air like a prayer. Tyler's face crumpled, and this time he couldn't hold back the tears. They streamed down his cheeks as he whispered, "Thank you. Thank you so much." Behind the counter, Gloria wiped her eyes with her apron. The trucker who'd reached for his wallet earlier came over and added a 20 to Marcus's pile. "For the kid's mom," he said gruffly. The elderly couple approached next, the woman pressing a folded bill into Tyler's hand. "You're a brave young man," she said softly. One by one, others joined. A construction worker, a young couple, even a teenage girl counting out crumpled singles from her purse. Within minutes, Tyler sat surrounded by the quiet generosity of strangers who had been invisible to each other moments before. The cook came out from the kitchen, carrying 3 large bags packed with containers of food, enough to last days. He set them on the counter and refused to meet anyone's eyes, but his voice was thick when he spoke. "Kid eats free here from now on. Both of them." Marcus helped Tyler gather everything. The money, the food, the sudden weight of kindness that must have felt as heavy as it was beautiful. At the door, Tyler turned back, his thin arms struggling to hold all the bags. "What's your name, sir?" "Marcus." "I won't forget this, Marcus. I promise I won't." "Just take care of your mom, kid. That's all the thanks I need." Tyler nodded and pushed through the door into the rain. Marcus watched through the window as the boy hurried down the street, his step lighter despite the load he carried. For a long moment, Marcus just stood there, his hand resting on the back of the stool where Tyler had sat. Something warm was spreading through his chest, something he thought had died with his son. An ember of purpose, of connection, of the feeling that maybe, just maybe, he still had something to offer this world. He returned to the counter and found his coffee had been refilled. Gloria smiled at him, the kind of smile that said more than words ever could. Around him, the diner hummed back to life. But it felt different now, softer somehow, as though the walls themselves had absorbed what had happened and would hold it like a secret. Marcus sat there for a while longer. The rain eased outside, the windows streaked with silver trails that caught the neon glow of the diner's sign. People began to leave one by one, offering him small nods or gentle pats on the shoulder as they passed. Nobody spoke much. They didn't need to. They'd all shared something sacred in that moment, something that would follow them quietly back into their own lives. When Marcus finally stood, the stool creaked beneath him. He adjusted his jacket, nodded to Gloria, and stepped outside. The air was cool and clean, the storm's anger now replaced by a soft drizzle that carried the smell of asphalt and new beginnings. He walked to his bike, the chrome wet and shining under the streetlight. For a second, he just stood there, staring at the reflection of the diner's flickering sign in the puddles. Lucky's. He almost laughed at the irony. As he swung his leg over the bike, he paused. Through the glass, he could still see Tyler's empty seat, a napkin folded neatly beside the plate, as if the boy had been raised to mind his manners even in hunger. Marcus felt something twist deep inside him. It wasn't pain this time. It was gratitude. Gratitude that life, cruel as it could be, still gave him chances to be human. That night, as Marcus rode his motorcycle through the city streets, the rain had stopped and the stars were pushing through the clouds. The wind whipped past him, but instead of the usual cold emptiness, he felt warmth. He thought about Tyler, about the boy's mother receiving the food and money, about the look of relief that would cross her face. He thought about his own son, gone but not forgotten. And for the first time in 15 years, the memory didn't break him. Instead, it reminded him of something precious, that love doesn't end. It just changes form, finding new ways to exist in the world. He passed under a bridge where a few tents huddled together. A man was sitting outside one, wrapped in a blanket, staring into nothing. Marcus slowed his bike and reached into his pocket. He had a few bills left, not much, but enough. He stopped, handed them over silently, and rode on before the man could even say thank you. Maybe that was what he'd done today. Maybe he'd taken the love he couldn't give his son anymore and passed it forward to someone who needed it. Maybe that was the point of surviving loss, not to forget it, but to let it teach you how to heal others. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to Bike Diaries, because sometimes all it takes is one act of compassion to change a life forever. Before we end, I'd love to hear from you. What would you have done if you were in that biker's place? Comment below. Your words might just inspire someone watching right now. As the neon lights of Lucky's diner flickered in the distance behind him, Marcus Kane rode into the night a different man than he'd been that morning. Not healed, perhaps, but healing. Not whole, but moving toward it. And somewhere in the city, a boy and his mother were eating a warm meal, reminded that even in the darkest times, kindness still exists, and strangers can become angels without ever meaning to.